All right, welcome back to Economics and Personal Finance. I'm Scott Wentland. And in this set of lectures, I'm going to talk about competition, monopoly, and profit, and really what are the role of these things in our market economy. So first, I'll start by talking about competition and profit and sort of how we think about this in economics. More or less in some broad terms, and I'll give some specific examples. So for decades, people thought during the last century, when the Soviet Union was around, that the Soviet economy, which was a command or communist economy, was much better than the US or a number of other market economies. Why? Why did people think that it was so much better, right? So actually for decades, people thought, well, in the US we have this wasteful competition, right? That we've got, if you look at, go down a supermarket aisle and you look at all the kinds of toothpaste that you can get. You can have 30 different kinds of toothpaste, 50 different kinds of laundry detergent, hundreds of different types of cars and all different shapes and sizes and colors and all sorts of options, right? Who needs all of this? Why can't we just figure out what is sort of the best one or the most efficient design and then just make those? In fact, we wouldn't have to waste all of our resources on all sorts of these alternatives that only some people like, and maybe they shouldn't even like them at all. And so the Soviets were thought to have all of this extra capacity because instead of producing these 29 other toothpastes, right, they just figure out what the best one is, and they use those resources to do other things, right? And so for much of the, again, much of the last century, that's largely how people thought, despite the fact that they didn't have a lot of knowledge about what was actually going on in the Soviet Union. That was at least part of the theory. Another part of the theory is that our businesses and our individuals within a market economy are motivated by profit, right? US entrepreneurs, business owners, they're motivated by this. Whereas in the Soviet Union and other command economies or other communist countries like North Korea, Cuba, other countries who have been communist in the past, China, of course, okay, these economies were motivated or are still motivated by the people, right? Businesses are making stuff for the people. They're making stuff for their fellow human beings, and that's what's motivating them. And so what's better, profit or altruism, right? What's sort of the more pure, higher motivation? Well, in this lecture I want to talk about, well, how wasteful really is competition? And why do we have so many variations of these sorts of things like cars and soft drinks and all the kinds of things where you see tremendous competition? Well, I'll start by saying that competition is a market force that strives towards efficiency. Right? Not inefficiency. Because if there's inefficiency, that turns out to be some money that's being left on the table here, right? That looks like an opportunity for somebody to make some money. So for example, if Ford or GM or some other American car company is not constantly improving, if they're not very efficient in terms of their quality and also in terms of their costs, that presents an opportunity for one of their competitors to get your business, right? So if they don't keep up, Toyota, Honda, Volkswagen, any number of car companies would be glad to sell an American a car that's better than what Ford or GM or whoever is offering it, right? So as a result, this competition forces people towards efficiency, and if they don't, then that's a money-making opportunity for their competitor to swoop in, to actually provide that. So in a market economy, the consumer is in the driver's seat, right? Sellers want to cater to the buyer's needs. And that's because in a market economy, consumer is king, or in economist jargon, we have consumer sovereignty. This is the idea that consumers have freedom to choose what they want to buy, and that's immensely powerful incentive for businesses. Because that means that businesses are constantly trying to think of ways in order to satisfy consumers because that's where the money is, right? Businesses need to change to accommodate what consumers want or else they're going to perish, right? If you ignore your customers, that's the sure way to go out of business in a market economy. So why? Well, if your customers don't like you, they'll go to the other guy, right? But this doesn't seem quite right, at least initially, right? It seems like big businesses dictate all kinds of things, right? Corporate America decides, well, we'll just try to increase our profits, even if that means that the consumers don't quite get what they want, because if we have enough advertising, if we try to trick them, right, they'll be buying this stuff anyways, okay? That's sort of one cynical way of looking at it, but let's dig into that. Let's dig into corporate arrogance in sort of past instances of this. One example of this is back from the mid-'80s. This is a very famous example of it. If you haven't read about the example of New Coke and what Coca-Cola tried to do in the 1980s, it's incredibly fascinating. For those of you who don't know, everybody knows Coca-Cola, but for those of you who don't know the story of New Coke, it turns out that Coca-Cola had found themselves in sort of a lull in the 1980s. That there were competitors like Pepsi who were gaining a lot of market share, and they needed to sort of do something to shake it up. They've had the same formula for quite a long time. They've tweaked it a little bit, but in the 1980s, they're like, well, what we want to do is we want to change Coca-Cola. We want to change our primary product. And so they came up with New Coke. And before it came out, it had one of the biggest marketing campaigns ever. They basically they bet the house on New Coke. They had endless advertising on television, on radio, on every sort of media presence that they possibly could. And they had this huge rollout. They had celebrities involved. They had all these, like everything that you learn about in a marketing class, they did it for New Coke. They rolled out everything. But there was a problem. New Coke wasn't any good. Consumers just didn't like it, right? As much as Coca-Cola, one of the biggest companies in the world, as much as they tried to cram it down people's throats, almost literally, right? Not exactly, but people just weren't going to take it, right? And so then it turned out that Pepsi ended up gaining market share, that people didn't like New Coke, right? So their solution was, well, they go back to the old Coke, okay? So the reason why you see on your cans of Coke, Coca-Cola Classic, which wasn't there before, right, this classic is referring to essentially old Coke, or what it was essentially before, okay? Ultimately, Coke had to submit and give consumers what they wanted, or else they were going to go under, right? And so no amount of marketing, no amount of advertising, no amount of trying to trick consumers in the world is going to really change the fate of Coca-Cola, because ultimately consumers are king. Now there are some exceptions to this where some companies, particularly with market power and monopoly power, can dictate more terms to their customers, okay? But that's precisely the need, underscoring the need for competition, right? Consumer sovereignty, right, along with competition, that pair, right, forces producers to make what consumers want, right? Ultimately, what consumers want are high quality and low prices, and some combination of these two things, right? So what economics provides here is some sort of unseen insights here. Once we sort of think through the market dynamics, right, we can think through this process where markets both set prices, not individuals, right? In our discussion of supply and demand, we learned that it's really that markets set prices, not sort of the individuals that are acting, and that consumers also decide what producers produce, not the individual producers, right? Both of these are counterintuitive. If you ask, again, I've used the example in the prior lecture, or in one of the previous lectures, that if you ask the person that runs the gas station who sets gas prices, they'll say, I set the gas prices. I physically set the gas prices. Well, our economics suggests that not quite, right? If you set the wrong price, right, the market is going to discipline you, right? Whether if it's too high, people won't buy your gas. It's too low, everybody's going to buy your gas and it's going to be out and you're going to lose money, right? And so ultimately, the market is the one that sets the price, even though the gas station or whoever is actually physically writing the price down, right? They look like they're setting the price. In the same turn, consumers are running the show. Even though Coca-Cola says, no, it was our decision to go back to Coca-Cola, right? It wasn't the consumers. No, it was exactly the consumers pushing the producers to produce what they want, right? And that's ultimately what we're interested in, right? Without these market forces, or in cases where these market forces are muted, right, as was the case in the Soviet case, right, you had essentially terrible low-quality products relative to the US. One of the reasons why during the 20th century people thought the Soviets had done much better is because essentially you couldn't freely travel to the Soviet Union and see what was going on. And in cases where you could, oftentimes they would show you sort of the places where things are going better, or at least where they put more resources into those places. It didn't show you the rest of the country or the areas where things had terrible low-quality stuff. Ultimately, what we found in the Soviet Union and other communist countries is that because they shunned competition by making international trade and other things more costly, and because they sort of shunned competition within their own borders, right, with burdensome regulations and other things like that, okay, they had low-quality products and high prices, or essentially people couldn't get good stuff in these command economies, okay? So it's really these multitude of factors coupled with competition that will get us these high-quality products with lower prices. For an economist, we sort of think about competition as a benchmark. And in fact, in markets where we have what economists call perfect competition, is a place where it's actually best for consumers and it's best for actually everybody overall, okay? So in perfect competition, okay, this is a market where you have a large number of buyers and sellers, okay, where firms are often referred to as price takers, okay? This is the case that I keep referring to is the gas stations who are essentially taking the price of the market, right? They essentially can look around it to see what the other gas stations are charging, and that's what they'll charge for the gas, right? The same is true for a corn farmer or soybean farmer or any number of industries in which there are a lot of sellers. They essentially go to the market and they see, well, what is corn or soybeans going for? And that's what they sell their product for. They can't really have much room in terms of negotiating price. In perfect competition, there's no entry or exit barriers. Anybody can freely enter the market that they want. So if I want to plant corn in my yard, I can do that, right? There's free competition, there's free entry into that market. If I don't want to plant corn anymore, I can plant soybeans the next year and I can exit that corn market, okay? There's perfect information, so people are aware of their opportunities in the market, and people are aware that things are valuable and a variety of other things, right? In a microeconomics course, we'll dive into that much more deeply, but not so much here today. Buyers can easily switch from one seller to another, right? This is consumer sovereignty as well, right? And products are generally very similar, right? So in a perfectly competitive market, one of the reasons why the gas station is able to sort of look at the other gas stations and see what they're charging is because they're essentially selling the same thing. If they're not selling the same thing, if their gas is very different or has different properties where the gas goes for the gas mileage as you get out of a certain gallon of gas is much different, that's not exactly this perfectly competitive market. Really what we're talking about is markets that are selling the same things. So this is sort of like the perfect storm of competitiveness. And when you have markets that are closer to this benchmark, you're going to get these more efficient sort of outcomes that are much more in line with what I'm describing with these competitive outcomes, okay? In perfectly competitive markets, firms face this intense competition. such that profits are at or near zero. And I mean, in this case, economic profits. Okay, what I mean by economic profits is that essentially you can do no better or worse than your next alternative, right? So you might actually have what economists call accounting profits. That is, you might actually have some take-home pay, but it's not going to be so much that it's in excess of what your other alternatives might be. Okay, so that distinction you'll get into more in a full micro course, but we probably won't really dwell on here so much. Okay, so there won't be a test question on the difference between econ profits and accounting profits, or at least for this section of lectures. Okay. The important point I want to underscore here is that this near zero profit condition is pretty interesting, right? Often we assume when we think about perfect competition, we think about sort of a competitive spirit. We don't necessarily associate that with, or at least I didn't initially when I was learning about this, I didn't associate that with lack of profits. In fact, I think of companies being driven by profits. That's their motivating factor. But once you think that through, you'll sort of see that profits are like blood in the water. Okay, profits draw firms into the fray. Okay, just like blood draws sharks near. And so what happens is that ultimately that profit is going to draw more firms in to ultimately bid down the price up until the point in which you have marginal benefit equals marginal cost, or up until the point in which firms become sort of indifferent between selling something and not selling something. Okay, ultimately that's where their profit is near zero. In this situation, resources are used very efficiently. Okay, and so that's sort of one of the benchmarks, the reason why we call perfect competition a benchmark. It's a condition in which we know our resources are used very well. Okay? From a social standpoint, this is precisely what we would like. We would like our resources to be used most efficiently, right? We would like competition to deliver products to consumers that they actually like and they like the best, right? And it's clear that producers or sellers of stuff may not like this so much, right? If you're a shark, right, you don't want other sharks in the water honing in on what you want, right? So if there's a shark that sees, a bleeding, seal or fish or something that it's going after for dinner, right? When all the other sharks hone in there, right, you could think of the more sharks that come along, the less the one shark is going to get, right? And in the extreme, if you have a ton of sharks come in, you're going to get actually very little, okay? It's the same idea in the market. Now, what that's great for is consumers, okay? Because consumers are ultimately going to get, through this competition, they're going to get something like low prices and high quality, right? At the end of the day, should we care so much about these sharks? Should we care about these firms as an ends? Well, let's think about, from sort of a social perspective, what are we doing with the economy, right? What is the whole point of having a market economy? Well, it's just a way of us cooperating in a way for us to get the kinds of things out of life that we'd like, right? We need food, water, shelter, like to have some entertainment. We'd like to, live life to the fullest in all sorts of dimensions, right? And that's ultimately what we're interested in, right? Or at least that's what we're interested to get out of the economy, out of the stuff, right? And so in fact, it's the consumption that is the purpose of the economy. Production is just a means to get there, right? This is a sort of a crazy idea because for the most part, a lot of the dialogue about the economy is focused on businesses and making businesses better and bigger and all of that. Well, really, at the end of the day, we want our businesses to produce stuff that people want And that's really the ends what we would like, right? Competition helps the market economy achieve these ends, or at least this is the perspective of the economist, right? The business person's going to have a different perspective because they're coming at it from the business person's perspective, and they don't like other sharks honing in on their stuff, right? So then what happens when there's not a lot of sharks that hone in on the stuff? What role does this profit play when there's only one shark, right? And this shark doesn't have this competition here. That's what we're going to dive into in the next lecture.